Today's video covers sections 2 through 4 in chapter 16. Basically, all that information in there culminates in the threats to biodiversity that we're facing today. So that's what we're going to be talking about. I understand one of the big things that's threatening biodiversity, threatening living things in those ecosystems, is pollution. Pollution can affect us in lots and lots of different ways, right? From affecting our water quality, is it going to be safe to drink or not, to possibly leading to acid rain. That sounds pretty dangerous as is, but it's not like you're actually going to melt like the Wicked Witch. In reality, acid rain affects the pH in aquatic ecosystems, but it also affects forested areas and plant life majorly because it can strip nutrients out of the soil. But also, another topic that is pretty big in the news anymore, right? Pollution can be leading to global warming. And I know there's a lot of argument out there as to whether or not global warming exists. But when it comes to the scientific community, it's pretty unanimous. Global warming does exist, and it's being caused by humans. So we are having a huge impact on our planet and the climate on our planet. And we need to be able to do something about that. So I'm not even really worried about whether you believe in global warming or not, because it does exist. There's lots of evidence that says that it exists. And almost every scientist out there that's not being paid by some major corporation to pretend like that global warming doesn't exist agrees that it's there, it's happening, and we need to do something about it. So, to be honest with you, it doesn't matter if you believe in it or not, because it's going to be there either way, and we have to deal with it. Okay, so starting with pollution in our water. One of the things that the book talks about is biomagnification. Wherein small amounts of pollutants can be picked up by that bottom of the food chain. But the reason why that matters to us is as that matter goes from the bottom of the food chain to the top, as consumers eat those producers and secondary, tertiary consumers start to eat those initial consumers, right? Every step up the ladder, every step up the food chain, that pollutant gets more and more concentrated in those organisms. So a lot of times it's not really the bottom of the food chain that gets affected by that pollution that's in the water, because that producer is going to have such a small amount of that pollutant in them that it's not actually going to hurt them. But at the end of the day, apex predators like you and me, eating those other consumers that have already picked up a lot of that pollution along the way, that concentration gets bigger and bigger as you go up the food chain. So that really, really does affect us at the end of the day. So we have to understand how that works and that idea, right? Since that plant, say it's grass, picks up a little bit of that pollutant, and then mice eat the plants and pick up that same pollutant, but they've eaten many, many plants along the way to get so that they could survive. And then you have a snake on the next level that has to eat lots and lots of different mice. Right? The whole point of being a consumer is that something else did the work for you to pick up all this stuff. Right? So you'd have plenty to work with. But when it comes to pollution, right, all those organisms down the food chain have picked up that pollutant for us, and it's hurting us. So biomagnification is a problem. Even with small amounts of pollutants, it can become a big problem at the top of the food chain. And a lot of times we're going to look for indicator species. To see if water's been polluted or not. A lot of times that's going to be an amphibian because they soak in that pollutant through their skin since they are the way they are. So if you see a frog with 3 legs, that might be a problem. So we're looking out for pollution that's in our water supplies, not because we're going to pick it up drinking the water necessarily, but because we know that the bottom of the food chain is picking that up, and it just gets bigger and bigger. The amount of that pollutant gets bigger and bigger as you go up the food chain. Okay, again, acid rain. I want you guys to recognize that can result from our carbon emissions, right? When we burn those fossil fuels, some of the products of that are sulfur-containing compounds that end up making sulfuric acid in the clouds, and that's what that acid rain comes from. Acid rain, like I said before, it's not exactly what you think. It's not going to make you melt or anything like that, but it does increase the pH of those water ecosystems. Excuse me. It decreases the pH of those water ecosystems, which can be a problem because you know that in homeostasis, all living things need conditions in very narrow conditions, and the lower the pH, the harder it is for those things to live in there. So that can be a problem first and foremost. But one of the biggest problems from acid rain is actually the stripping of nutrients from soil. And so those plants that depend on those nutrients, and ultimately every consumer somewhere along the line depends on those plants, that they're not getting the nutrients that they need, they're going to end up dying out. It can affect ecosystems large scale pretty quickly, even those that are on land, right? So it's going to be bad. Obviously, that acid rain is going to be bad for things that are in the water because that's going to change the pH of the water. But it's also going to be really bad for those things on land too, because you're going to strip those nutrients out of the soil, and ultimately your food chain is going to depend on that. Finally, we have global warming. With this, we need to talk about the difference between global warming and the greenhouse effect. Right? The greenhouse effect is what causes global warming. If you have an increase in greenhouse gases, those are what trap that radiation, that heat, to increase the temperatures. But a certain amount of greenhouse effect is absolutely necessary. Greenhouse effect is the only reason why our planet is even habitable, right? There has to be a little bit of trapping of that heat, or else it'd be too cold on this planet for us to survive, for any of the living things to exist. So you need to understand how greenhouse effect is a good thing, because it actually makes it warm enough that we can exist on this planet. Otherwise, it'd be way, way too cold. But an increase in those greenhouse gases that can increase that temperature. So if we continue to burn those fossil fuels and put out carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are affecting us too, like methane, if we continue to increase those gases in our atmosphere, that's going to continue to increase the temperature in our environments, and that's ultimately what we're talking about when we talk about global warming. Right? There is an increase in global temperatures, right? And it's a overall average temperature that's increasing. So even if on a local scale you don't see that, and you like to pretend like it's colder here than it used to be, well, it's not really about a local area. If you lived in the northeastern part of this country and you've experienced the snowstorms that they've had in the last 10 years, of course you're going to think, well, it seems like it's getting colder. But you have to have a broader view when you're looking at this and understand that just because that one place, that local area, is having colder temperatures doesn't mean that the overall temperatures aren't increasing. And we can very clearly see that with the evidence that we have, that global warming exists, it's affecting our climate, it's what's causing those storms to happen in all reality. So we need to deal with that. We need to understand what we can do to lessen the amount of greenhouse gases that we produce so that we can try to halt that problem. Okay, aside from pollution, some other major threats to biodiversity come down to very simple things like us destroying those habitats that those living things live in, right? If we continue to tear down rainforests, there's no place for those things to live, for those, whatever it may be, whether it's an insect, a monkey, a bird, whatever it is. Right? If it doesn't have a habitat, doesn't have a place to live, it's probably not going to survive. So that's definitely a huge impact on biodiversity, and we have to think about that. I know that we require space to live, but that doesn't mean we have to clear cut forests somewhere so that we can take that resource again, like we talked about in the last section. We need to be a little bit more responsible in those respects. The other major thing has to do with problems of introduced species. And that's mainly talking about invasive species. Right? Sometimes we think it's cool to bring this pet from one place to another, right? Taking it across an ocean even, without realizing that if it got free, if it got loose in that new environment, in that new habitat, that new ecosystem, it might not have any predators to keep it under control, and it can completely devastate an area. There never used to be rabbits in Australia, but once they got introduced there, that population has gotten out of control, right? And it's destroying crops and all sorts of ecosystems in that area, and it's a real problem because they don't really have any natural predators in that place. So you got to be careful when it comes to things like that. A lot of times invasive species can be insects, right? But they can also be obviously small mammals and lots of other things. It can even be plants that kind of take over an area. Okay, so at the end of the day, threats of biodiversity, if you understand some topics from pollution, destroying habitats, how invasive species can affect an area, will probably be good. So that's it for these notes.